French Revolution was the economic cause. The economic condition of France formed another cause for the outbreak of the French Revolution. The economic condition of France became poor due to the foreign wars of Louis XV. The 7 Years' War of Louis XV and other expensive wars. During the reign period of Louis XVI, the royal treasury became empty and extravagant expenses of his queen, Marie Antoinette. To get rid of the condition, Louis XVI appointed the Turgot as his finance minister in 1774. The Turgot tried to minimize the expenditure of the royal court. He also advised the king to impose taxes on every class of society. But due to the influence of Queen Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI dismissed Turgot. Then Necker was appointed as the finance minister in 1776. He published a report on the income of the expenditure of the state in order to arouse the people, but he was also dismissed by the king. The next person who was appointed by the king as the finance minister of France in 1783 was Cologne. He adapted the policy of borrowing in order to meet the expenditure of the royal court. But due to this policy, the national debt of France increased from 3 million to 6 million francs only in the 3 Years' War. Then Cologne proposed to impose taxes on the class, but he was dismissed by the king. In this situation, the king at last summoned the States General. The economic instability formed one of the most important causes of the French Revolution. The next is about the three estates. France's population had changed considerably since 1614. The non-aristocratic members of the Third Estate now represented 98% of the people, but they could still be outvoted by the other two bodies. In the lead up to May 5th, meeting the Third Estate began to mobilize support for equal representation and the abolishment of the noble veto. In other words, they wanted voting by head and not by status. While all the orders shared a common desire for the fiscal and judicial reform as well as a more representative form of government, the nobles in particular were loath to giving up the privileges they enjoyed under the traditional system. By the time the Estates General convinced at Versailles, the highly public debate over its voting process had interrupted into hostility between the three orders, eclipsing the original purpose of the meeting and authority of the man who had convened it. On June 17th, with talks over procedures stalled, the First Estate met alone and formally adopted the National Assembly. 3 days later, they met in a nearby tennis court and took the so-called tennis oath, vowing not to disperse until constitutional reform had been achieved. Within a week, most of the clergy disputes and 47 literal nobles had joined them. On June 27th, Louis XVI grudgingly absorbed all three orders into the new assembly. The wave of revolutionary favor and widespread heuristica quickly swept the countryside, revolting against years of exploitation. Peasants looted and burned the homes of tax collectors, landlords, and seigneurial elite, also known as the Great Fear. The Origin instruction hasn't been growing justice of nobles in the country and inspired the National Constituent Assembly to abolish feudalism on August 4, 1789, signing the historian Georges Leverrier, later called the Death of the Certificate of the Old Order. This is the beginning of the end. Feudalism ends. On October 2nd, 1789, feudalism gets abolished, and it is also the end of King Louis XVI. Individual rights are voiced. On August 4th, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. a statement of democratic principles grounded all in philosophical and political ideas of the Enlightenment, thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The document proclaimed the Assembly committed to replace the Ancien regime with a system based on equality, opportunity, freedom of speech, popular sovereignty, and representative government. Drafting a formal constitution proved much more of a challenge for the National Assembly, which had been added a burden of functioning as the legislature during harsh economic times. For months, its members wrestled with the fundamental questions about the shape of expanse of France's new political landscape. For instance, who would be responsible for electing the delegates? Would the clergy own alliance to the Roman Catholic Church or to the French government? Perhaps most importantly, how much authority would the king, his public image, further weaken after a failed attempt to flee in June 1791, retain? Adopted on September 3, 1791, France's first written constitution echoed more moderate voices in the Assembly, establishing a constitutional monarchy in which the king enjoyed royal veto power and the ability to appoint ministers. This compromise did not sit well with influential radicals like Maximilien Robespierre, Camilla Desmoulins, and George Danton, who began drumming a popular support for the more Republican form government and trial of Louis XVI. On June 17, 1889, the members of the Third Estate, French Parliament, General's Estate, who won the First Estate, the nobility, or the Second Estate, gathered and declared themselves the National Assembly of France. Alarmed at radical development, King Louis XVI decided to end the deliberations and barred access to the room in Versailles, where they had been meeting. Over the next several days, most members of the clergy and the General Estates and a significant number of nobility declared their support for the new assembly. On June 27th, but one of 577 members of the Third Estate swore to stick together until they had drafted a constitution for the country. It became known as the Serment Judaire de Penum, or the Tennis Court Oath. After the location, these parliaments gathered after being buried earlier meeting place by the king. Louis XVI then decided to invite the other two estates to join the assembly on June 9, 1789, became the National Consult Assembly. On August 4th, the assembly accepted the proposal from one of its representatives, Jean-Josephine Malter, to add a declaration on human rights to the beginning of the Constitution. On August 12th, a committee was elected to examine and merge the various proposals of the declaration. A document comprised 19 articles and was presented on August the 17th and discussed during parliamentary sessions on August 20th, 21st, 25th, and 26th. Haroun Mabiu read the declaration from the podium on August 26th, and it was adopted on October the 2nd. While riots were raging, Louis XVI approved the text on October the 5th, 1789, with much quieting from Marquis de Lafayette. The Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen on August 26, 1789 is one of the fundamental texts included in the preamble to the French Constitution of October 1958. Presented here is the first printed edition of the collections of the National Library of France. This is the end of the beginning. In April 1792, the newly elected Legislature Assembly declared war on Austria and Prussia, where it believed that the French imageries were building counter-revolutionary alliances. It also hoped to spread the revolutionary across the ideals across Europe through warfare. On the domestic front, meanwhile, the political crisis took a radical turn when a group of insurgents, led the extremist Jacobins, attacked the royal residence in Paris and arrested the king on August 10, 1792. The following month, amid a warfare of violence in which Persians instructionists massacred hundreds of accused counter-revolutionaries, the Legislative Assembly was replaced by the National Convention, which proclaimed an abolition of the monarchy and established the French Republic. On January 21, 1793, it sent King Louis XVI, commanded to death for high treason and crimes against the state, to the guillotine. His wife Marie Antoinette suffered the same fate 9 months later. Following the king's execution, the war of various European powers and intense divisions within the National Convention ushered the French Revolution into most violent and turbulent phase. On June 1793, the Jacobins seized control over the National Convention and more moderate Gardens and instituted a series of radical measures, including the establishment of the new calendar and the eradication of Christianity. They also unleashed a bloody reign of terror, a 10-month period which suspected enemies of the revolution were guillotined by thousands. Many of these killings were carried out under orders from Robespierre, who dominated the Dorokian Committee of Public Safety, until his own execution on July the 28th, 1794. His death marked the beginning of Verdun reaction, a moderate phase in which the French people revolted against the reign of terror excesses. And this is the end of our presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it.